So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our first fireside chat. My name is Noor Ghadanfar and I am one of the co-founders of Relief Syria. I am a Syrian, and as someone who spent many a summer and winter in Syria, this issue is near and dear to my heart, as it is, I'm sure, to many of our viewers here today. And with that, I'd like to introduce John, who will introduce Relief Syria as an organization.
Hi, everybody. I'm John Mahana. I'm a Syrian, Syrian American, born in the US with tremendous ties in Syria, with lots of families still living over there. And we recently started Relief Syria as a grassroots initiative. It was created to share information and spread awareness about the ongoing effects of the sanctions enacted on Syria and its people, and the consequences that have developed as a result of a decade of conflict, economic downturn, and an unprecedented pandemic. Relief Syria aims to advocate for Syrians' inalienable right to live fulfilled and dignified lives in their homeland, specifically as it relates to economic opportunity. Today, it pleases me to say that Relief Syria will be conducting its first fireside chat. Our fireside chats will be an informal conversation with various guests about US sanctions on Syria. In our conversations, we hope to address the real-world implications of these sanctions and spark a more truthful discourse among voters on how these sanctions affect the ability of Syrians to survive. Having said that, Noor, please introduce our first guest.
Thank you so much, John. Dr. Joshua Landis is the Sandra McKay Chair and Director of the Center for Middle East Studies and the Farzaneh Family Center for Iranian and Persian Gulf Studies at the University of Oklahoma in the Boren College of International Studies. He writes and manages SyriaComment.com, a daily newsletter on Syrian politics, and publishes frequently in policy journals such as Foreign Affairs, Middle East Policy, and Foreign Policy. His book, Syria at Independence, Nationalism, Leadership, and Failure of Republicanism, will be published by the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies this coming year. He is a frequent analyst on TV, radio, and in print, and is a regular on NPR and BBC. He has received 3 Fulbright grants to support his research in Syria and won numerous prizes for his teaching. He is the past president of the Syrian Studies Association. He's also lived 15 years in the Middle East and 4 of them in Syria, and has spent most summers in Syria before the uprising in 2011. He was educated at Swarthmore, has done his master's at Harvard and his PhD at Princeton. He is also married to Manar Kashur and has 2 sons, Jonah Firas and Kendall Shaban. And with that, welcome so much, Dr. Joshua Landis. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us.
It's a pleasure being with you both. Thank you, John, and you, Noor, for inviting me to discuss this really important topic.
Thank you.
So before we dive into the topic of sanctions, we'd love to understand what got you so interested in Syria in general, as well as the sanctions topic in particular.
Well, I grew up in the Middle East. My father was a banker. He opened the first American bank in Saudi Arabia. And I spent my first 4 years there, and then in Lebanon for 6 years, which was really the most important part for me because I remembered it well. Then I went back to teach in Lebanon during the Civil War in 1979 when I graduated from Swarthmore, and spent 2 years trying to figure out what was going on in the Civil War, studying Arabic. I applied for Fulbright, went to University of Damascus in 1981-82. That was the year of the Hama uprising, which was really, in some ways, a prelude to the last 10 years of war in Syria, and the Israeli invasion in Lebanon, and that got me interested. So I began to study. I wrote a dissertation on Syria. I've gone back and forth umpteen times, married a Syrian, and so sanctions are just the latest bit, and they seem, because I'm an American and I'm interested in American foreign policy in Syria, it's the one thing that America can do that has an impact on Syria, a big impact on Syria. And so it's been, it's important, and it's hurting the people, not the regime. I mean, it hurts the regime, there's no doubt, but it's not going to cause any of the things that America is seeking to bring about through sanctions, but it is hurting the people tremendously, and that's and that I think it's important to speak out and to educate people on this, and to really try to develop some pressure on our government not to continue this policy, which is damaging.
Yeah, we couldn't agree more. And so especially on the educational part, if we take a zoom out for a second, and could you just briefly explain the concept of sanctions and maybe secondary sanctions for an audience that might not know what it means specifically?
Right. Well, sanctions are something that began in the 1970s with the United States, began to apply sanctions on Syria for supporting terrorism, and this has to do with the PLO, and they really began to multiply after we invaded Iraq. The United States invaded Iraq in 2003-4, when the United States took a very new attitude toward Syrian occupation in Lebanon, and had always described it as a Syrian presence in Lebanon, because America had encouraged Syria to enter into the Lebanese civil war in the first place. And then it changed its attitude after invading Iraq, and wanted to get Syria out of Lebanon, causing the murder of Hariri and all kinds of turmoil, which then led to a lot more sanctions. And then, of course, with the uprising of 2011, you get a whole nother layer of sanctions. And 2019, we got the Caesar sanctions, which added secondary sanctions, which are very important, because there's primary sanctions by the United States, which are really sort of two types of sanctions. One is what are called targeted sanctions, are against elite members of Syria. There are about 320 Syrians that are designated for sanctions. That means that they can't move their money outside of the country, or in American banking system. It's frozen. Whatever money they had outside is frozen, and they can't travel to the United States. Now, EU has also done the same thing, and they coordinate on this. So there are about 300 and some odd Syrians that are, they're mostly the elite Syrians who are in charge of the economy and the big industrialists who help the regime in one way or another. As you know, everything is very centralized in Syria. So it affects the economy quite a bit. But then there's secondary sanctions, and those are the most recent ones that have the widest impact, because it means anybody, not only an American or a European, that assists a Syrian or a Syrian institution in evading sanctions will be sanctioned himself. And some of those sanctions are broad sanctions. They're not just against individuals. They're sanctions on things like petroleum and energy sector in Syria. That means anybody who helps a ship that's carrying oil get to Syria can be sanctioned. Any insurance company like Lloyd's of London that would normally insure a ship cannot go to a port without being insured. So if you hit all the insurance companies, nobody will take a ship. And that means only Iranian ships are now carrying oil, because most Russian ships are owned by private companies and they don't want to deal with this stuff. But Iranian ships have been the main carriers because they're owned by the government and they're leased by the government. The problem is that in order to stop those infractions, the United States and Israel have been putting mines on Iranian ships, and about 12, 13 tankers moving towards Syria have been scuttled by using these mines. So it's really a large-term effort to strangle the economy and put pressure on the regime, and that has been described. The reasons for it, the politics behind it, have described in several different ways. One is to, let me just read you a little paragraph about some of the language that's used in the Caesar sanctions, which is, they are supposed to compel the government of Bashar al-Assad to halt its murderous attacks on the Syrian people and to support a transition to a government in Syria that respects the rule of law. So those are two reasons. One is humanitarian reasons. The other is for a change of government. But there are also James Jeffrey, who was President Trump's special envoy to Syria, just said in a moment of frankness, said, my job is really to turn Syria into a quagmire for Russia and Iran, which is, we understand that this is not going to change the regime. It's not going to stop the government from trying to get back, for example, Idlib or the Northeast, where the Kurds are a dominant force. But we can turn Syria into a quagmire, a swamp for Russia and Iran. In other words, they won't be able to make money by impoverishing the people and the government. We can make it a burden because they're going to have to put money in and they're not going to get very much out. And therefore, their policy, their benefits they hope to get out of Syria will turn into, liabilities. That's the idea, and make them, eventually abandon Syria or something like that, I guess would be the idea. So those are the various policy objectives, and sanctions are very wide. The banking, for most Americans, Syrians, and Syrians who live abroad, the worst aspect of sanctions is they cannot use the banking system. The banking system cannot do business with Syria. You can't send money to your relatives. And that's really the worst aspect for most, because most Syrians today need money from the outside. And those Syrians that are not starving, and we have to remember that according to the World Food Program, 80% of Syrians live below the poverty line. 60% are food insecure. They're not getting enough food. So malnutrition is widespread. And those people who are not malnourished are getting money from outside mostly. And I know, my family, my wife sends money and her sisters send money to their parents, which is the only thing that keeps them from freezing to death in the winter and food on the table during the year. And I'm sure that's true for your families as well. And so that's the banking system is the worst part of the whole thing, because America, 70% of all world trade is done in dollars. And America can stop all of that dollar exchange in banks. And so the SWIFT code, which is international banking system, runs on the SWIFT code, which is just a series of numbers that helps transfer money from one bank to the next. That's frozen and controlled by America. And so they can stop that, and all banking, no banks will send money to Syria. So that's the long version.
Oh yeah, and especially the limitation on sending money isn't just about sending money directly to Syria. I had an instance where we had an Arab alumni dinner, and it was focused in a Syrian restaurant, and I Venmo'd a friend Syria dinner. And that Venmo didn't go through because it had the word Syria in it. And it was, I'm in the United States, my friend is in the United States, just had the wrong word in my Venmo. And
well, and Noor, that really brings up a topic that's important here, which is over compliance. Banks, companies, everybody are so frightened of getting caught in a legal system and having a case brought against them by the Treasury Department or by anybody else who wants to sue them for breaking this, that when they see a word, they just, like the word Syria, if it's used, they will not do any business with anybody that used the word Syria. And that kind of over compliance, because companies will be destroyed. They can go bankrupt if they get caught in a legal case, even unintentionally. We just had a few months ago, a Romanian bank was charged over $1 million for sending wood. It helped in a transaction that transferred lumber from Romania to Syria, and America sued them for $1 million and got there. They had to cough up $1 million. Another French bank, same story, for numbers of millions of dollars. So these banks get smacked with big, heavy fines if they're caught, and often they don't realize it because some private citizen is. So they just don't use, and NGOs in Syria who are trying to help, with food and stuff like that, they constantly complaining that when they set up a bank account in Lebanon, for example, and they need to buy a computer, if they're honest and say that is for a computer that they're going to use in Syria, banks will say, no, you can't have that account. They'll shut down their accounts, and they can't, they can't operate because of just exactly what you said. It was just using the word Syria. Boom.
Yeah. And so also taking a
So
step
how do
back.
you get money? Let me ask you,
Yeah,
how
yeah.
do you get money, each of you, to family in Syria? What do you have to go through?
John?
Well, I mean, sorry, no, I would say that you have to take hard cash with you. You know, you find someone that's going over there, you give them whatever money you can give, and usually, it's definitely probably going to go over that 10,000 mark that you're restricted to, um, and that's how they do it. Um, and I actually had I had a relative go over there recently from the States, and not only is he taking a lot of money with him over there, but he's also traveling to different parts of Syria to send money for other families.
Right.
So it's incredibly inefficient, um, and it's astounding, really, the whole what it's caused for people. Um, and Yeah, you touched on a very important point. I think two things: one, the overcompliance from businesses, because they don't want to get hit with fines from the U.S. government, and also what that means for NGOs. Because a big part of these sanctions and a big part of proponents of these sanctions really say that this is really affecting the war criminals, the people who have committed crimes in Syria. And it's not, they're not meant to go after food or anything that helps Syrians survive. But I think what we kind of learned through the process is that that's just not the case.
No, in fact, it's the opposite, because
Yeah.
putting sanctions on the country so broadly, really, these are theoretically supposed to hurt the elite, but in many cases, it actually helps the elite because the average person can't get hold of any of the important goods they need. Prices are inflated. Uh, Banks won't do business. Normal companies won't do business. That you start up an import smuggling company that will avoid these, and it's the rich elite who run all of this smuggling,
Right.
and we've learned in places like Iran and others, it really privileges those people who have money and have connections and can figure out ways around, because then they're going to capture all that extra money that people are paying for these scarce goods.
No, absolutely. And also just zooming out, I wanted to ask you, just in the research that you've done, have you seen instances where sanctions have been used successfully in the past to target situations or regimes like the Syrian regime, or
Yes,
have they mostly been affecting normal citizens like we see in the case of Syria?
there are some successes, and it's important to mention them because this is what most people point to when they try to justify them, and
Right.
that's South Africa, and then the Libyan regime, which had sanctions on it for over 20 years and did end its nuclear program, which was one of the objects. Of course, it then got out of sanctions, and sanctions were lifted. But of course, Gaddafi was overthrown a few years later, and so you can. But South Africa is the major model. But of course, South Africa is very different from Middle Eastern regimes. It was a white regime, of course, opposing apartheid, which people objected to, and that was a big movement in the 80s to divest in universities, and it went to companies, and the regime was very sensitive to it because they depended on support from the West, and they depended on capitalism.
Mm.
And so this led to the end of apartheid. And people say that the sanctions and the boycott really did have an effect. But when you take that to regimes like the Assad regime or Saddam Hussein's regime or the regime of the mullahs in Iran, they don't have effects. Or Venezuela or Cuba, they don't have effects because these systems are so, and the elites are so worried about being turned out of government because they believe that they will be killed, and probably they will be if they step down, that they're not going to change and they're not going to leave power because of sanctions. What happens is that the people starve. And we've seen that in Iraq, where the United States imposed very brutal sanctions on Iraq in the 90s. And the UN estimated that 500,000 people died of starvation, health issues, others, malnutrition, because of those sanctions. And, very brutal. And we're seeing the same thing in places like Venezuela, which is emptying out with people, Cuba, which is, just sent out refugees and has struggled for decades without changing the regime and without any of the behavioral changes that people demand. So what I think is that most of our politicians impose sanctions not because they really expect them to work, but because they don't want to do nothing. Washington policymakers are really prejudiced against saying, America can't do anything about this. We're going to turn the page. And so they want to do something, and that is the least costly thing to them and to the American government is to impose sanctions. Even though it may be just exactly the wrong policy that has the wrong impact.
Right. Right. So would it be possible, I know you actually briefly, we're talking about sanctions more broadly, but a lot of what we do focuses on the Caesar Act, the sanctions associated with that law. And I know we touched on it briefly, but could you maybe explain a little bit what these sanctions hope to accomplish in Syria?
Well, the stated goal is that it's to punish the regime, really, and to stop Assad from mass murder. That's the way it's usually described by supporters. Now, they were passed by the U.S. Congress in 2019. So the war was largely over by that time, but it had taken them a long time to develop this and pass it through Congress. And it was finally enacted and actually imposed in 2020. So it's fairly recent. And it became imposed at the same time that Lebanon went bankrupt. So it's very hard to disambiguate the impact of the sanctions from the monetary collapse in Lebanon, which we know had a profound effect on the Syrian economy, probably larger than almost anything else, because we believe that around $40 billion of Syrian money were in these dollar-denominated accounts, because Syrian banking system is very primitive. Nobody trusts it. They're worried about the pound collapsing. So everybody had transferred their money into these dollar accounts, which they thought were safe in Lebanon. And my own family, my brother-in-law had all of his life savings, a few tens of thousands of dollars in a dollar account, which evaporated and left him, without any future money. But I'm sure, that was a small amount. But compared to many Syrians, I'm sure it was, many Syrians, just all their businessmen, everything, their money went up in smoke, and as it did the Lebanese, and we've seen the impact on the Lebanese. But if you look at the graph of the Syrian pound and the Lebanese pound, they collapse almost at the same time in the same way. Now, there had been a terrible effect over 10 years of warfare in Syria on the Syrian pound. But most of its devaluation has happened since the Lebanese banking system, because it had gone to about 500 pounds to a dollar. Before the war, it was about 57 or something like that.
Right.
Then it went down to 500. But now it's down to 3,000 something. It bounces around 3,200 or something. So, the average government salary today is about $20 a month. And it was just raised by the government 40% so that it wouldn't be so bad. But it's nothing.
Yeah.
And I know I was joking on the phone with my father-in-law, who's 84 or something like that, and mother-in-law, who's combined. One was a teacher, one was in the military, retired when he was 55. But between the two of them, their pensions my father-in-law was joking, and he said, you know, we calculated it out, and we can buy 8 roasted chickens, our monthly pensions today. And that's, you know, true of all the Syrian pensioners from one end, you know, and they were a big number of Syrians, you know, something like 2 million people depending on those pensions, and they're worth nothing. So it's just wiped out the middle class and the pensioner class and government employees, which we know in Syria was a very big sector of the economy because everybody wanted to work for the government and get that monthly, you know, even though it's not very much, it was enough to sort of give you some kind of stability. And that's why the poverty rate is 90% in Syria today, because that the pound has just been destroyed. And now Caesar sanctions, of course, have made all that worse. I don't want to say that they're the main reason for it. You know, we know that first of all, you've got lots of corruption in Syria, bad government, but you've got 10 years of very destructive civil war, which of course harmed so many people and destroyed the infrastructure, schools, you name it. And then there's Lebanese banking collapse. But sanctions are really preventing any outside capital from coming into Syria in order to regenerate some momentum in the economy, and have really paralyzed the situation. Because a lot of people would invest in Syria today, even though there's those dangers of terrible corruption, insecurity. Land prices are at rock bottom.
Right.
You know, my brother-in-law called the other day and he said, you know, for $20,000 you can buy this like 2 hectares and a little farmhouse. It was about 5 kilometers from the sea in the north of Syria.
Yeah.
And you know, to imagine that, but that same property would have cost just hundreds of thousands of dollars before the war.
Exactly.
And there are a lot of people who would buy those things if they could maneuver it, and you know, who would be willing to take that kind of risk. You'd obviously have to have some family in Syria, have some kind of protection. Who knows what you would need, but nobody's going to do it today.
Right. No, yeah, I know many stories, especially, I mean, my family's village is about an hour outside Damascus to the south. And, you know, I think a property, the equivalent of about 5 acres is going for $10,000.
Is that right?
Great farmland, but, but no one has the capital to really produce anything there. And you know, it's true, you know, it's enticing for potential investors, but you know, there's too much difficulty in transferring money there, and then also you have to deal with just the headache of, I guess, just trying to make it work.
Too many problems. And when would you ever get the return on it? And could you go and live on the place, or all those questions you just don't know the answers to it. And those are not, you know, the fault of sanctions, but sanctions add another layer of difficulty onto everything in Syria and raise the price of everything, of doing business and of buying things.
Exactly. And so, from your thoughts, do you think that there are sanctions that could be maybe a little bit more targeted here, like truly targeted, where they're not harming the general population? Do you think that, in order to feed that need to do something, which obviously the U.S. is trying to, what they want to feel like they're doing, do you think that there would be a better way to go about that?
I do. The targeted, I can't argue with the targeted sanctions of going against people. They're very broad, and who they've defined as people supporting the regime, it means almost all businessmen have to do some kind of business with the regime. But it's the central bank, the commercial bank, the banking system, the oil, for example, trying to keep oil from Syria. I just don't understand. I mean, I understand the logic of it, which is to impoverish Syria. But that is terrible, because what it means is no electricity. People are going to freeze. But it means you can't run a school without electricity. You can't run the most simple business. You can't run hospitals without it. And to buy a separate generator, which is the way to get around the state's inability to provide electricity, you can't get mazot, you can't get the diesel fuel and so forth that are going to run those machines because it can't get into the country. And on top of that, the United States still has troops in the northeast of Syria and in Tanf. And the northeast is where most of the oil is, and the United States has kept that oil out of the regime's hands. So the regime doesn't have its own oil. The Syrian government can't exploit Syria's own oil, which is held out of, and specifically for that reason, to deny the government money. And so going after such a broad sector like energy means no electricity. And you can only imagine the hardships that come in every layer of society. And it means people can't go to the hospital, clinics, they can't get warm in winter. Their refrigerators don't work. I mean, the joke in most Syrian homes now is that what's a refrigerator good for? It's for keeping the ants away from the food because you can't use it to refrigerate. So you have to go out to the market every day and buy things, and even in the marketplace, you can't keep food cold. It's leading to all kinds of disease and terrible things, and it's just ruined the standard of living. And that's not going to produce democracy, because we know that the less educated people are, the less likelihood they're going to get to democracy. This is a counterproductive policy in any which way you look at it. So, the short answer to your question is that most of these sanctions are very broad. They're blunt-edged sword, and they're designed to hurt massive amounts of people, most of whom are innocent, insecure. That's children and the elderly who are hurt the most by sanctions. The UN has condemned these things, but at any rate, that's where we are.
And your mention of the UN, I think, is important because the sanctions, a lot of them are American imposed, and the U.S. the signal the U.S. gives to other countries is also is an important signal. And so, how do you see the influence that these sanctions have had on how other countries wish to engage with Syria? Obviously, we've seen China, Iran, Russia kind of taking the opposite approach, but just in general.
But they don't take the opposite approach. You look at China has largely fallen in with sanctions on most Middle Eastern countries because it doesn't want to fall afoul of the United States. And China used to get about 20% of its energy from Iran, for example. It cut way back on that when the United States imposed sanctions on Iran. Now, increasingly, China is beginning to do business again with Iran, but it has paid a high price. You look at Huawei, the big telecommunications firm. The number 2 in command, the daughter of the CEO, was arrested in Canada. Why was she arrested in Canada and held for a few years? Because their company had gone around sanctions and was helping Iran develop their telecommunications industry and build towers and stuff like that. And so America called on Canada to arrest her when she was traveling through Canada, which they did. And so it's very costly, even for a China, which is a big country that can do things on its own, but it doesn't want to fight America on this issue. Now, increasingly, it may do so as America begins to put pressure on China and our relations deteriorate. I imagine that China will try to push back and hurt America by breaking these sanctions regimes. And increasingly, we're seeing pressure from the local Middle Eastern countries, particularly Jordan and Lebanon and Iraq, to stop. They've asked America to lift and reduce these sanctions because all of them are very worried about their own economies and their own people. And Jordan in particular, which has good relations with the United States, has had some impact on this. And the king has asked Biden to lift sanctions on, or at least reduce them. because it needs the trade. And it's worried about its own economy imploding like Lebanon's, because it has a very big knock-on effects to the whole region.
Right. And as we talk about Jordan and Lebanon and Iraq, do you believe we're moving towards re-engagement and normalization of relations with Syria, especially with countries in the region? I mean, just a few days ago, the UAE Minister of Foreign Affairs was in Syria for the first time since 2012, right?
And China gave a phone call, and both Algerian foreign minister and Egyptian foreign minister met with the Syrian counterparts in the UN when they were. So there has been movement, and there's a lot of talk.
And also, why now is I think the biggest question.
Well, I think it's because the war is largely over. I think everybody is coming to the understanding, along with the United States, that Assad's going nowhere. There's no opposition that can overthrow him. And no countries are now pouring money into the Syrian opposition, trying to build them up, or nobody's going to invade Syria or overthrow Assad. So you can't imagine how he's going to be toppled, unless he catches some bad disease and dies, but then somebody else from his family or somebody else is going to replace him. The regime is not going to be overthrown. The government is not going to be overthrown. And everybody who understands Syria a little bit realizes that the government is not going to make big concessions. So when America says that it's waiting for UN Resolution 2254 to be enacted, and that's a resolution that was passed by the UN in 2015 that said that there had to be a fair elections overseen by the UN that would create a transfer of power, meaning Assad has to go. So America still clings to that language of regime change through this democratic process, but it's wishful thinking. It's not going to happen. And you talk to any American policymaker and they say it's not going to happen, even at the same time as they're repeating that they've got to enact 2254. So there's this sort of willful denial of reality. But we just heard today that both the foreign minister of Qatar, while visiting in Washington with his counterpart, they both said we're not going to lift sanctions and that people should not engage with Syria. And as long as sanctions are not lifted, which brings us back to the topic of our day here, it's sort of meaningless to say, oh, we are going to send our foreign minister to Syria. Because no company, whether it's Jordanian or Kuwaiti, or is going to want to do business, is going to dare to do business, unless it's a little squirrely company that doesn't have any exposure to the American banking system or anything else, and it's not going to be, harassed by the American government. But those are not companies that are going to rebuild an electric plant, and that's a real problem, because India was committed to rebuilding the electric plant in Deir ez-Zor and had spent money there, but it withdrew because it couldn't get the financing and it was too dangerous for them. So Russia stepped in, but it's only, they had to make concessions to Syria. It's costing Syria a tremendous amount of money to try to rebuild this energy sector because nobody's touching it with a 10-foot pole.
Wow.
Mhm.
So yes, people are beginning to re-engage because what other choice they have. And I think the Arab public in general does not want to see Syrians starve, because they will become refugees just the way the Afghans are becoming refugees now. And they have been doing this for years, and they're flooding their countries, and they're burdening countries like Jordan and Lebanon and Turkey and Iraq. They're all screaming, and they can't afford it themselves. And the resentment against Syrian refugees has gone up through the roof in all these countries. And so there's tremendous pressure to change this situation and get Syria, as the Kuwaiti foreign minister, or the UAE foreign minister said a year ago, we've got to bring Syria back into its natural position in the Middle East. And I think that there will be intense pressure to do that, but it's going to be very hard as long as sanctions continue to be imposed.
Wow. Well, with that, I would like to thank you so much, Dr. Landis, Joshua, for taking the time and talking to me and John. This was extremely insightful, and I'm sure our viewers will feel the same. I wonder if you have any other closing remarks that you'd like to say before I ask John to close us out.
Well, I think, first of all, I just want to thank you both for inviting me to do this discussion with you. But secondly, no matter what one's politics are towards the Syrian government, towards what's going on in Syria, American foreign policy, I think that every Syrian should agree that these sanctions are really they're hurting the most innocent people and the most vulnerable people in Syria. They're not doing any good, and they shouldn't support keeping these on, because they're not going to bring the intended objectives, the stated objectives, which is either to change the government or to or to punish the regime in some important way, to make it change its behavior. And there's got to be other ways of doing that, because this is just counterproductive, and it's going to. I think it's going to strengthen the regime. Of course, the regime will be weakened, as well as all Syrians, but in relation to the people of Syria, it will strengthen the regime, because it's the poor people who are hurt more than the rich people.
Yeah. Well said. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Landis, for your time and for a great conversation. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you both. It's a lot of fun to talk with you.
Thank you. And thanks to our viewers for watching. To stay connected with Relieve Syria, you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Just search for our handle at Relieve Syria on Facebook and Twitter, and Relieve Syria, that's one word, on Instagram. Leave us a message. Let us know your thoughts. Hope you all enjoyed our first Fireside Chat, and have a wonderful day. Thank you.